should
sure. As you like, Uta.
Well, I was just going to say welcome to everybody and just give a quick shout out to Edella and Tommy, because they were the ones that initially helped me translate the institutional grammar and actually apply it in practice to my documents. So they were very instrumental in me doing my own research. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you to them. So Saba, you can go ahead now.
Okay, great. I'm so happy to welcome Edella and Tomás Olivier here for our research seminar. Really delighted to hear their research that is titled Institutional Design Using the Institutional Grammar and Social Network Analysis. There's been a growing interest in the IG user community in engaging social network analysis and IG studies. So really excited to hear what they're doing in their work, so we can all learn from them and develop whatever they've initiated. So Tommy and Edella, over to you.
All right. Edella, I don't know if you want to say something before we start.
I'm just delighted to be here, and thank all of you for being here, and we're looking forward to the comments that you have on our work. And I'm going to let Tommy take it away then.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you all can see it. Can you see it? All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Uta, for the kind words, and thank you, Saba, for this opportunity. We're both really excited and happy to be able to share some of the work we've been doing for quite some time now in combining insights from the institutional grammar and social network analysis. So as Uta said, as Saba said, my name is Tomás Olivier. You can call me Tommy. I am an assistant professor of public administration at Florida Atlantic University. And I'm going to be presenting on some of the work that Edella and I have been doing for a while now on this combination of networks and the grammar. The way I'm thinking this presentation, I've structured this presentation is that for the most part of the presentation, I want to share with you a paper that Edella and I had written and that we have submitted to the Policy Studies Journal as part of a special issue in the institutional grammar, where we're trying to combine these two approaches to further understand institutional design, but also how institutions are affecting and influencing behavior. And by doing that, by talking about this paper, I think it gives us a good opportunity to show you some of the motivation behind this work and why we think it makes sense, and then show you an application of this approach. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to take a few minutes then to take a step back from that paper and talk more in general about this approach and this idea of combining networks and the grammar, and to show you with you all some ideas and things that we have been thinking about in terms of how to further explore this approach and how to leverage tools from social network analysis to further understand issues of institutional design. So to get started, a little bit of perhaps the main motivation behind this idea of combining these approaches comes from the fact that we see social network analysis tools and approaches as a way of capturing configurational relations or patterns or complexity, right? And this idea of configurations, we see it present not only on the institutional side of things, on the design of rules, but also on the behavioral side of things. If you look at the literature, for instance, on the institutional analysis and development framework, we will find out that institutions are not just an aggregation of rules, right? But they're rather a specific arrangement or configuration of rules that aim to produce certain potential outcomes. This is present in the notion of action situations. And even when we zoom out of the idea of action situations and we understand or we think about networks of action situations, these are also configurational structures that are put there sort of to guide and constrain behavior towards a certain outcome, right? Even if we look at the literature on common pool resources theory, for instance, and look at the notion of design principles put together by Ostrom, Ostrom was very clear in highlighting the fact that the design principles are not a blueprint or a laundry list that we just like tick the marks and that's it, right? But rather that the design principles themselves are build on one another, build on characteristics of their physical environments, their community characteristics. So they're configurational in that sense as well. If we look at more recent work, for instance, that has highlighted that specific configurations of design principles oftentimes have an influence influence successful governance of common pool resources under specific circumstances, or even when we look at the design principles themselves individually, a design principle is not just one rule, but rather a configuration of rules put together with a specific goal of achieving that design principle, right? Another way of thinking about this idea, this configurational role of institutions is bringing institutional arrangements and actor interactions into the same modeling enterprise. And this is something that's core to the IID, this idea of the configurational understanding of institutions and behavior, right? At the same time, there are other literatures that have looked more specifically into behavior. For instance, in the literature on policy networks, have analyzed how in policy settings we have multiple participants interacting in particular ways, and those interactions might result in specific patterns, and how those patterns of interactions are likely to vary depending on the context, such as, I don't know, the levels of interpersonal risk between these actors, or that different patterns may affect environmental outcomes or organizational performance. Both of these literatures recognize one another and work on findings from one another, but we still argue that there's a missing piece in the connection between the literature on policy networks and the literature on institutions, in the sense that the literature on policy networks, for instance, focuses on how networks self-organize, or on structural variations and what can we learn from those structural variations. And even though this literature acknowledges that institutions matter, we believe that the institutional arrangements have not been explicitly accounted for in these studies. For the most part, these studies deal or address the importance of institutions in the research design stage by saying, let's compare networks where an institution is present, say where, I don't know, a collaborative institution is present, versus networks where that institution is absent. But we argue that, rather than thinking about if institutions matter, we think it's time to start thinking about how institutions matter, right? And in this paper, one of the guiding research questions that we have is, well, to what extent then do different configurations of interactions prescribed by the rules overlap with those interactions that we observe on the ground? In other words, if we could go and ask the rules, okay, who do you think that people should be interacting with? And we looked at those patterns. Well, how would those patterns overlap with the ones that we would obtain by asking people who they interact with, right? And in this paper, we develop a series of hypotheses about, institutional design, and then a hypothesis about how these different kinds of rules overlap. In the presentation, these kinds of networks overlap. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the latter, and I'm going to highlight two hypotheses that we're working on in this paper. One is a pretty basic one in that we argue that those collaboration networks that we can obtain by asking people who they interact with should have a positive overlap with the interactions that are prescribed by the rules, right? Because at the end of the day, the role of an institutional arrangement is to guide, shape, and constrain behavior, right? But we also acknowledge that this level of overlap should not be the same for all different, rules, right? There should be some rules that might have a higher or lower overlap than others. And in particular, we argue that collaboration networks will have a higher overlap with patterns of interactions that are mandated by rules that create credible commitments, or that create these power sharing arrangements that constitute sort of like the cornerstone of the institutional structure, if you will, right? Then, and the overlap should be lower between the collaboration networks, and other types of rules created to, say, provide or produce public goods. Now, if you're with me up until this point in this, now the question becomes one of, okay, yeah, this makes sense, but how can we translate those institutions into networks? And to answer this, well, we say we can rely on the institutional grammar. And by this, by institutional grammar here, we're referring to the 1.0 version of the IGT. This is just a snapshot of how that data looks like in a very raw form, right? We argue that we can leverage this very rich data that we can obtain to build networks that are conceptually meaningful, right? And that we can analyze those networks. And the reason why we believe we can do that is twofold. On one hand, because, as I mentioned before, institutions are guiding constraint behavior in a configurational fashion, right? And statements act in conjunction with other institutional statements. But at the same time, we argue that statements are intrinsically relational, and that there are many ways actually in which we can capture those relational patterns, right? In this paper, we're just highlighting one, right? That we think it's a pretty also straightforward in that pretty much every institutional statement will have an attribute that the statement says has to do or may do or should not do something to an object. You know, that attribute has to do something or may not do something to that object that will receive that action. So we can think of that relation prescribed by the institutional statement as a sort of a dyad. You know, the attribute has to do something that's received by, in this case, an animate object, a person, an organization. And the content of that dyad or that arrow could be defined by, say, the deontic or by rule types, if we're thinking of information rules that prescribe the sharing of information or payoff rules. If we then take for every institutional statement and identify these dyads, and then we aggregate them, we end up with a network, you know, that we term a network of prescribed interactions, which is how this institutional statements in a given institutional arrangement are prescribing that people should, may interact in a given setting. In this application, we are only looking at positive prescribed interactions. So statements that refer to obligatory or permitting deontics. We're not including forbidding deontics because those require a different interpretation. So just in this case, we're only looking at those kinds of statements. And then say, okay, we want to do this. We want to use this to test our hypotheses. And the case where we're testing this is the New York City Watersheds governing system, which I know that many of you are familiar with because I know that some of you have been playing with this data for other projects. But for those of you who don't know about this case, this is an institutional arrangement devised by the city of New York and a series of local governments located outside of city limits, north of the city, on where there are several watersheds located from which the city of New York gets its drinking water. Now, these watersheds are of extremely high quality. So the water in there is really high quality water, up to the point that the city of New York has obtained a waiver from the EPA that allows them to use that water, deliver it without filtering it. Now, in order to maintain that filtration waiver, the city of New York needs to show proof that they can control what happens in those watersheds. So the city developed with this arrangement with the watershed communities, the state of New York, the EPA, and a series of environmental organizations through which they establish how they're going to go about managing these watersheds in such a way that the city can get this high quality water and that the watershed communities are not negatively impacted by another jurisdiction coming in and telling them what to do. So to test our hypotheses, we use two sources of data from this case. On one hand, we have institutional data, which are more than 3,500 institutional statements that we've coded with Edella and Jeff Hanlon. It took us more than 2 years to get those statements coded by hand. And then, so we coded all those statements, and then we grouped them into bundles or three groupings. On one hand, we have statements that create these power sharing arrangements, these credible commitments. These are statements that refer to the creation and functioning of decision-making venues, venues for conflict resolution. They establish procedures for rule enforcement. And at the same time, they refer to to fundamental programs that if those programs don't work, the whole arrangement basically collapses. Then we identified another bundle of statements that refer to economic development programs that were developed to make sure that the watershed communities are not left behind and can advance their economies. And then we have a third set of statements that refer to the creation, operation, and maintenance of water-related infrastructure. The second set of data that we used is survey data that we collected in 2015, in which we targeted organizations that are involved actually in the implementation of this arrangement. And we asked them things such as, I don't know, who they interact with, or their perceptions about their partners, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to jump straight ahead and show you some results from this. First, these are the networks that we can create by applying the institutional grammar that we call networks of prescribed interactions. In these networks, a red circle is an organization, and an arrow connecting two circles means that there's at least one institutional statement that tells organization A to do something to organization B, or basically it tells the attribute to do something to the animate object. If you look at these, you'll notice that they look at least a little bit different, right? Which sort of seems to indicate that these sets of rules are establishing configurations of prescribed interactions in different ways, depending on the types of problems they're trying to address. At the same time, we use the survey data to build a collaboration network that we call. It's a network that we build by just asking people, who do you interact with and collaborate when referring to issues related to the arrangement. This network only has 40 organizations, which are the 40 that responded to our survey. And so in order to compare these 4 networks and to keep them on the same size, we had to, excuse me, reduce the size of the networks of prescribed interactions. So we used a reduced version of those networks that has only these 40 organizations. So the first thing we did is we just correlated these networks and see how they overlap. This is just a table of correlations, and 2 things I would like to highlight. First is that the 3 MPIs have a positive and relatively high overlap, ranging from 0.62 to 0.79. But perhaps the most important thing here is that these 3 MPIs correlate positively with the collaboration network, which is what we were sort of hoping would happen. And then we noticed that the power sharing MPI, the one that creates these credible commitments, has a higher overlap with the collaboration network relative to the other 2. This is sort of like, a good sign, but it's not enough for us to say, okay, our hypotheses, are supported by the data, right? So the next thing we did is we conducted exponential random graph models, which are just network models that allow us to, in other words, model network data. One of the issues with network data is that they're interdependent. So they violate the assumption of independence, and we can't really use linear models here. So we rely on exponential random graph models that basically allow us to test whether certain parameters can help explain the presence or absence of linkages in a network. In our case, the network we're trying to explain is the collaboration network. And we're trying to identify which parameters can help explain the presence or absence of those collaboration linkages. So we conducted 2 models, one in which we have only the 3 MPIs as parameters of interest. And what we found here is that only the power sharing MPI has a positive and statistically significant effect. Of course, this is sort of unrealistic because it's very unlikely that just the institution will explain patterns of behavior, or in this case, collaboration. So we ran a second model where we included a series of additional parameters that have been identified in the policy networks literature as important in explaining partner selection in policy networks and in collaboration networks. And even when accounting for those factors, we still found that positive and statistically significant effect of the power sharing MPI on behavior. In other words, the linkages that are present in this power sharing MPI tend to be present also in the network of collaboration, even when accounting for additional parameters. So what is this telling us? Well, there's 3 things that I think are 3 lessons that we could take from this paper. First of all, that I haven't mentioned much, but it's in the paper, is that these networks of prescribed interactions do look different. And it indicates that these rules are prescribing different configurations of interactions between actors to address different kinds of collective action problems. We know that happens in the behavioral world, but we still didn't know if that was really the case in the institutional side of things. And this is giving us evidence that that might well be the case in the institutional side of things. At the same time, we did find that these prescribed interactions have a positive overlap with the collaboration patterns. So in other words, that rules are actually guiding and shaping behavior. But we only found that the power sharing arrangements rules are the ones that have a detectable influence on behavior. And this is, we argue, because these sets of rules create, these shared decision-making venues or processes that have been in place since the inception of the watershed arrangements. The same with these very fundamental programs that are vital for the arrangement to work. And therefore, they have left an imprint on how actors collaborate, detectable even when we account for other types of rules or additional parameters. Now, this is we're starting to scratch the surface on how it is that institutions are influencing behavior, or how they matter in influencing behavior. We still argue that we still need to know a lot more about, for instance, the relationship between institutions and other factors that could explain these patterns of collaboration or behavior. For instance, we need to know more about in what settings do policy beliefs play the more dominant role vis-a-vis institutional arrangements, and why? Or in our case, we're looking mainly at rules. So we argue that it will be interesting to know more about how these institutional arrangements interact with norms and strategies that these actors have on the ground and how those shape behavior. At the same time, other types of questions have to do with the fact that maybe it is that these networks of prescribed interactions have different effects depending if they're dealing with planning processes, or if these are networks that establish planning processes versus these are networks built on rules that are more regulatory rules. In that sense, we're working with Karen Ingold and Laura Herzog and Edella on another paper where we're looking at different kinds of rules that are perhaps more regulatory and trying to analyze those as well. But at the end of the day, there's still key conceptual questions that we argue need more work, and that they have to do with the fact of how can we leverage this rich amount of data that we can obtain by applying the grammar. In our case, we're only looking at rules that are positive and only that have animate objects, right? So there's a lot of data there left that we argue could still be leveraged to further understand issues of design. Also, it could very well be that some people might say, I don't really care about interactions between actors. If I want to understand how rules are configured, I don't care about networks of actors, right? So is there a way in which we can capture those other types of relations? And we argue that, yeah, it is possible. And now I'm just going to take a step back from this paper to highlight some next steps or open questions that we think are, or different ways in we can now leverage all the tools and concepts that we have from social networks to understand and answer questions about institutional design and about the effect of institutions on behavior. Some of these examples that I'm going to show you came up in a book chapter that we have recently published with Edella and Tyler Scott from UC Davis, in which we use social network analysis concepts to look at these networks from different angles and see what can we learn from that. For instance, one thing we do is we look at hypergraphs. Usually when we think of networks, the way we think of networks are just collections of dyads, as I mentioned to you before, these aggregation or this putting together all these attributes and object dyads, right? Hypergraphs are different than networks in that they are supradyadic, in the sense that a linkage can have more than just two actors. So let me just show you with an example here. We have this institutional statement 92, that says, on or before July 1st, 1999, the city and state shall each submit to the WPPC written progress reports. Traditionally, or in the approach we used in this manuscript that I just presented to you, we would have interpreted this as two separate linkages, one going from the city of New York to the WPPC, and another one going from the state of New York, sorry, here, and another one going from the state of New York to the WPPC. Hyperedges, or in hypergraphs, allow us to combine those two in one single linkage. So it provides us a perhaps more realistic way of understanding how an institutional statement is bringing together a group of actors. One of the downsides of this approach is that the methods and tools that we have to analyze these kinds of networks are not as popular or widespread as or advanced as the ones we have to study traditional networks, right? Excuse me. Additionally, what we can do is try to bring the institutional statements into the network itself as a kind of node to see from a different perspective how it is that rules are bringing together actors, right? And we argue that this could be done by looking at two-mode networks, where we not only have actors, but we have actors and rules. One way of doing that is by just doing, this is what we've done in that paper with Edella and Tyler. We've added the institutional statements as another kind of node. And for instance, we have, this is the statement 92 that I just read to you. In this situation, we have the city of New York and the state of New York. Here's the city and this is the state. Each of them are sending a linkage to the institutional statement, and then the statement sends a linkage to the WPPC. We kept the direction of the arrows because that allows us to maintain the richness of the IGT data, and that we can distinguish attributes and objects. You know, the attributes are going to be sending linkages to the statements, and the objects are going to receive linkages from the statements. Now, you might be saying, okay, yeah, this looks cool, but what can we do with it? And one of the things we have been playing around in a different paper with Edella, Laura Herzog, and Karen Ingold is to use this approach to further understand how institutional statements are creating specific patterns of interactions, arguing that it's not the same to have a statement that tells me that I have to do something to another person than having a statement that tells me that I have to do stuff to a group of people. The collective action involved there might be different. It might require different, I don't know, strategies. So we can actually capture those instances by looking at these networks of prescribed interactions where we have an actors, institutional statements, and actors. So we can actually look at the networks and count the instances in which these structures are present, or look at which which type of rules rely more on these structures versus these other structures, and to further understand how is it that rules are creating these patterns. Additionally, you can tell me, well, I don't care about actors. What if I just want to look at, understand the configurations of institutional statements? Well, and we argue that you can use still this data or this approach to create one-mode networks where the connections are between statements. So you have, say, two institutional statements that are connected to one another because by the number of actors they have in common, the number of attributes or the number of objects they have in common. Building on the example I just showed you, that will look kind of like this. You know, we have statement 92 connected to statement 48 because they have two shared actors. Statement 92 connected to 74 because they have one shared actor. So this allows us to create a network that is not only capturing those relationships, but also those relationships are valued. So they're weighted, those edges. These are some things that we have been playing around with. Still, we argue that there's a lot of ways in which we can leverage the tools we have from social network analysis to further disentangle the complexity and configurational nature of institutional design. For instance, we can think of multiplex networks, where rather than just capturing one type of interaction, we can capture the interactions prescribed by different rule types, and to see to how the specific rule types are used to, I don't know, create specific patterns between key actors in the networks, how those rule types are bringing them together. Alternatively, we can bring in the inanimate objects into these modeling network enterprises, network approaches. And now we can understand relationships or prescribed interactions between actors in the context of, say, I don't know, the maintenance of infrastructure or the creation of a plan to have a more detailed picture of how those interactions are prescribed. And finally, what I think it's perhaps one of the ideal situations, or something that I would personally like to do in the future, is to use this approach to analyze data over time. We have tools from social network analysis that allow us to model network evolution. Well, we can use these networks of prescribed interactions and apply those methods to test questions about institutional change. Or if we have information on institutions and behavior, we can see how the networks of institutions and behavior co-evolve over time. And I think, you know, those are things that could be potentially really useful for understanding institutional design, but also for bridging the connection between these two literatures that talk to one another, but still there's sort of like a missing link that we argue there. I'm just going to leave it at that, if that's okay. I've lost track of time, so I apologize if I went over. I want to thank you all for your time, and sorry if I went too fast, but I look forward to your comments, your questions, your suggestions, and if you have any ideas for future work, I think both Edella and myself will be really happy to discuss those. So thank you again. I'm going to, there we go.
Thank you, Tommy. You didn't go over time, so you were just right on. Anybody have any questions for either Tommy or Edella? Osaba?
Yeah, first, Tommy, thank you. That was a really great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I guess one question that I have for you is, you talked a lot about the opportunities, and I was wondering what you encountered as challenges. So what do you see, you know, what were the key challenges that you faced in this research?
So this is something that Edella and I have been talking about for quite some time. I think the first challenge is related to the IGT 1.0, which is that, you know, it requires a long time to code these documents. It took us, you know, more than 2 years to do it. Now we're very hopeful that with the IGT 2.0, that the time frame will be reduced. In addition to that, it's not just the time it takes to code the statements themselves, but also if we want to translate these statements into networks, it requires an additional level of coding, which is going statement by statement and making sure that, you know, the attributes and the objects make sense. And by making sense, I mean, we've had statements that referred, I don't know, that said the signatories had to send a report to the municipalities. So it requires some time, you know, going back to those statements, read them in context and figure out what they meant by signatories and what they meant by municipalities. And that took some time as well. And you have to read statements in context. So it's quite complex. And then the other challenge, I think, is trying to not lose track of the fact that, you know, of what we mean by these connections in a network of prescribed interactions, right? Because yeah, we can analyze these networks, but I think it's important to never lose track of the fact that these are very different types of connections or linkages than the ones we would observe by asking people who they interact with. So I think it's sort of like I don't know, at least in my case, I always have to keep that in the back of my mind, even when running models, because there are sometimes parameters in a model that might not make sense in a network of prescribed interactions, and that would make sense in a behavioral network, if you want to call it that way. Those I would say are perhaps some of the biggest challenges, I would say. On the other hand, you know, the good thing about this approach is that it allows us to overcome some challenges that are commonly present in social network analysis, especially when dealing with survey data, which have to do with the boundary of the network. You know, sometimes when dealing with survey data, it's really difficult to know if you've like exhausted all the possible actors in that network, in that situation. Whereas in this case, we know for a fact, if we do a good job of identifying the key documents that are part of the arrangement, then we would know that we would have a pretty decent picture of these prescribed interactions. I don't know if Edella has anything else in addition to that, but I would say personally, those are the main challenges.
Yeah, no, I agree. You covered the challenges well. Tommy. And so that's what I think is one of the promising aspects about the IGRI group, or really the RCM group, where there's an effort to develop software for machine coding the statements that could really make this type of work much more accessible, because you know that you're not facing many months of manual coding in order to do this work. So I'm excited about the work that Doug Rice and Seth are doing in that regard.
Dr. McInnes?
I didn't quite hear that, but I'll go ahead and ask the question. This is fascinating work, Tommy, if I may. I'm really glad to see you go through the different types of ways that social network analysis might be integrated in or connected to the IED and in the grammar. But one of the things you point out as a potential source of concern is one of the ones that really hit me pretty close. These rule configurations should be defined by something other than just connections between the actors. And I realize that that's the place to start, because that's where the social network analysis was set up, and all the behavioral stuff is going to be focused on those kinds of collaboration things. But there was another part in your analysis that I wonder if you pursued and thought about a little more. It's sort of the connection to the policy network part. I was kind of struck that when you took these 3,500 statements and sort of grouped them together into 3 different bundles, each of those bundles looked to me like kind of a sub-policy network within that system as a whole, where each of those networks, the actors there are doing something different. They're sharing power, they're building economic development policies, or they're actually running the infrastructure and maintaining the things like that. That struck me as more getting closer to kind of the action situation kind of network that I was working on earlier. And I think that's another way of carving this situation, this policy domain up into not so much the actors who are interacted with each other, but the kinds of things they're doing. And I'm not sure exactly where in the grammar there's a statement about what it is they're doing. Are there different verbs, different aims? And you might be able to collect together statements that are talking about similar kinds of aims or similar kinds of behaviors, rather than just connecting to different actors. It strikes me that would connect into the policy network literature a lot better. And that there you would have, and I thought when your hypotheses were set up, you were kind of going in this direction, that you could carve up this big system into 3 different policy networks focused on different kinds of things. And there's going to be differences in both the actor connections in the behavior, there would be implications for the actor connections based on the behavior connections in the rule basis. And so you could compare that to what you actually see in the process, but that you might have very different structures. You went through pretty quickly when you had those 3 subdomains in there, and you said they look different. To me, they look kind of similar. They all had a cluster with a lot of outlying sorts of things, but I don't know the network literature. But I'd encourage you to dig into that a little bit more and say, what are the differences among those 3 clusters in the terms of what kinds of behaviors are emphasized or what kinds of approaches are going in there. But I just think it's fascinating work, and encourage you to keep going. And it's nice that there's folks out there still working in the stuff and not just, watching it on my computer. So very nice stuff.
Great, thank you, I appreciate it. To answer some of your questions, yes, first of all, I completely agree that it would be, when we put together this survey in 2015, it would have been nice if we had included questions that targeted different kinds of interactions that would allow us to get at that point specifically. And I think that's something to keep in mind for future iterations next time we go on the field. But yeah, I completely agree that we're just taking a very blunt look at these interactions. But I think still it's kind of interesting to see that even when we look at just very general types of interactions, we see these effects, especially from those rules that create the credible commitments. Another thing that, yeah, in the paper, I recognize I went really fast on the comparison between the MPIs, but in the paper itself, we do include additional data that points out and additional analyses that point out to the fact that these networks do look different. And in fact, they do look different in ways that things in the arguments in the literature of policy networks have been made. So like the idea of the risk hypothesis that says that when we face cooperation problems, we tend to see more bonding in a network, and when we see coordination problems, we tend to see more bridging. So we do see some of those variations, perhaps not in such a crisp way as the risk hypothesis would argue, but we do see those differences in the MPIs themselves. Additionally, I think that the next step, the sort of like immediate next step, I would argue in terms of looking at this data is looking at these networks again, these networks of prescribed interactions, but bringing in the inanimate objects. So to understand, these relational patterns in the context of, the operation of a wastewater treatment plant or the creation of, a water quality monitoring plan. And I think that would allow us to get an even more precise picture of how these arrangements are structured. But yeah, I completely agree with your points, and they're very well taken. So thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
And I'll dive in just for a second. I think Tommy did a nice job of answering your question, Mike. We have another paper that's just been accepted, and we didn't mention it today because we don't use social network analysis in it, but we've done something similar to what you're pointing to, which is that each of these types of public goods can be thought of as, or at least the configurations of rules that create them can be thought of as an action situation. And so in that paper, we have roughly around 60 distinct types of public goods. So we have 60 distinct action situations. And then we also have another, I think, 11 credible commitment arrangements that are different power sharing arrangements that have been created. And we explore, to a certain extent, we explore what are actors doing in these action situations. Do they have monitoring mechanisms in place? Are there ways of challenging actions when one actor thinks that a rule has not been complied with? We look at how are relationships defined, like in economic development goods. It's really hard to measure. Did you accomplish what you wanted to accomplish? And so maybe they have different types of monitoring systems than in an infrastructure public good. So we took a more detailed dive into it. I think it would be interesting to, and I think Tommy feels like he's spent half of his life in this data. But I think it would be interesting to maybe break it out a little bit as you're suggesting, Mike.
We had one more question from Elizabeth.
Hi, good to see you. And thanks for an awesome presentation. And it's really cool to think about new ways to integrate these things. I was wondering, so you're connecting actors and objects pretty explicitly in your networks. I was wondering if you thought about some of the other parts of the grammar, like under certain conditions, these things may happen, or a kind of an or else thing. And I'm pretty new to both IG and network analysis myself, but I'm kind of thinking about maybe something like a multiplex network could be really interesting, where like certain connections are kind of conditional on something happening, but all of those conditions are so different, right? So it's not like, you can kind of create just one type of tie. So I was wondering if you've thought about any of the other parts of the grammar and how those might be integrated into your analyses.
Yeah. Well, first, hi, Elizabeth. Good seeing you. Thank you for your question. And yes, I completely agree. This is again, when you look at these NPIs, it's just like a very perhaps a low def picture of these prescribed interactions, right? But one of the things that we have thought about, and we still, at least I am personally still struggling on how to incorporate that. It's just looking at the conditions. One of the things that we did early on when coding these statements with Edella was to parse out the conditions. Not just have a conditions column when we code the grammar, but rather distinguishing conditions between what, when, how, and that creates another set of problems that we can talk about at a different time. But that's one way in which we could, if we can try to incorporate or figure out a way in which we can use those conditions as weights of these linkages and identify situations where the weight of the linkage will be, I don't know, higher because there's fewer constraints for that actions, or because they're more, that prescribed interactions is more constrained. That I see as one way of incorporating those particular elements. And another way is, as you well mentioned, is this idea of multiplex networks and bringing in the notion of the rule types, as I just showed in that example. If we want to get really, really complex, we can think about multiplex networks with different kinds of nodes, not just multiplex networks connecting actors, but multiplex networks connecting actors and things and inanimate objects, for instance. And those are things that, I've thought a little bit about, but I'm still, trying to figure out the way of actually doing it. It's possible, but it takes a little bit of time, I think. But yeah, I definitely, I'm heading personally at least in that direction.
Yeah, that's super interesting to me. I'm thinking about some of the work I'm doing with Aaron Delata on urban water using the IG, and how important some of those conditional rules are to the types of behaviors we're investigating. So like you can declare, that people need to restrict their lawn watering under these certain conditions. And even though that might be a pretty restrictive rule, it's a really critical one to how water sustainability is achieved in some of our cases. So yeah, so I'm really excited to see where this goes, and maybe we'll have a whole nother coded data set that we can try out your social network analysis kind of approach on. So we're working through that now, and we've limited it to a couple rule types just to start. But yeah, this is a neat way that we could expand on it. So I'd love to talk to you guys more at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, hi, Elizabeth. Good to see you again. Hope you're doing well. Just to build off of what Tommy was saying and what you're suggesting, I think coming out of the workshop and out of the IAD framework, and for the most part, not working with surveys, I found initially network analysis and surveys to just be too thin in the qualities of the relationships that we're really interested in. And I think that your question goes right to that, because when you ask people who are they interacting with, right, what you find out is obviously who they're interacting with, and then maybe are they exchanging information, or are they exchanging resources? But that their relationships are much richer than that. And that's also true with network analysis. If you're looking at just ties between an attribute and an object, you capture that tie, but you don't get at the quality of that tie. And in coding all of these statements, there's so much rich information about the quality of those relationships, and when those ties can happen and when they can't, and under what circumstances. And those are all the conditions that you're pointing to. And I think that this is really an area that's ripe for exploration, because you can think of these rules as at least like the execution constraints or the execution conditions that show up in IGT 2.0, where rules are turned off and turned on at different times for different reasons. And you could imagine sort of this larger network where you can, that captures the dynamism of these rules, where you can see, I don't know, I'm just talking off the top of my head and I'm getting a little crazy here, but you know, you can see rules turning off and on depending on what the actors are doing and depending on the situation. So if you have a drought at a certain level, you could imagine these watering restrictions, those rules are turning on, but when you're in a different setting, those rules turn off. And so I just think what you're pointing at is really interesting work that still remains to be done.
We had another question from Jens.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Edella, for the very nice presentation. I was wondering on one aspect you said would be done in the future. So how would you approach connecting the norms and the policy beliefs to your research work? Would it be just a different set of documents, or is there some other substantial changes that you might need to do? Maybe I'm just completely wrong, but when I'm marrying policy beliefs, the advocacy collision framework just pops up into my head, just connecting to it. How do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Jens. Yeah. So, for instance, in the case of beliefs, Edella can talk more about that. You know, she has a working paper with colleagues combining this approach, the ACF and the IAD. But you know, in terms of beliefs, I think, you know, that's when survey data come in handy. That's when additional types of documents and encoded in a different way. I'm not very well versed on how the ACF approaches its data collection techniques and processes, but I think leveraging that could come in very handy. And in the case of norms and strategies, yes, it is quite tricky. And personally, I have found that, you know, I see that Emily Bell is here, and her and I have been trying to code a document that it's mainly just strategies, applying the grammar, and it's hard because, you know, it's mainly just very vague attributes, and you know, and that's about it. You know, maybe some aim, and that's it. So it becomes really tricky to if you want to pursue the networks route with strategies. With norms, perhaps it could be more doable, but I think, yeah, I completely agree in that that's another active area or an area that requires attention, and in the future it will be really good working with it. The thing we're doing with Emily, for instance, is we're trying to leverage tools from automated text analysis to parse out these strategies, which are very complex and tricky. So it's giving us a bit of a headache every now and then to try to do that. But you know, that's something we're trying and see if that could work.
And I'll just add a couple of comments on using the ACF and the IAD. I think that rules don't determine behavior, right? Rules create they create action situations, they provide guidance and constraints on behavior, but they don't determine all of the different forms of behavior that you'll see in any given action situation. And so that's, I think, also when you see beliefs coming into play, that people choose who to interact with, and they don't only have to interact with the actors that the rules say that they must interact with. And so you see all different types of interactions and patterns of linkages among actors based on their beliefs that you don't necessarily find in the networks of prescribed interactions. And so one of the things that we would like to do is to begin exploring different settings where we would expect that rules are going to play a much more central role in the types of interactions we see, and compared to settings where the rules are going to be less constraining, and then look at how those different rule types interact with policy beliefs on the part of the actors, to see how beliefs and institutional arrangements interact to guide and constrain behavior. So it's an area that we're working on. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what Tommy and Emily come up with in working with norms and strategies. I think that sounds really interesting.
Any other questions? Comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much to our presenters for their excellent presentations, and thank you for the great participation and all the questions, great questions and stimulating thoughts that you've shared. Our next research seminar is on January 8th, and Marcello Sisi will be presenting on rule typologies for constitutive rules. He's here right now. I don't know if he wants to turn his camera on, but he'll be presenting in January. There he is. So he'll be talking about constitutive rule typologies, and then in February, we'll have Dr. Lynn Westphal presenting on rules don't speak. People don't speak in institutional statements. That should be a really interesting one as well. So that's what we have planned for the next 2 months. I hope you all have a happy holiday, and we'll see you next year. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.